Picture this. It's 1942, the middle of World War II, and someone walks into Winston Churchill's office with the most insane proposal the Prime Minister has ever heard. Sir, what if we build an aircraft carrier out of ice? Now, you'd think Churchill would throw this person out of the room, right? Maybe question their sanity? But instead, Churchill leans forward, lights his cigar, and says one word: brilliant. Because here's the thing. This wasn't just some crackpot idea. This was a genuine military project that the Allies actually started building, and it almost changed the entire course of the war. This is the story of Project Habakkuk, the ice ship so crazy, so massive, and so secretly advanced that most people today have no idea it was real. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you're going to learn about floating fortresses, bulletproof ice, and why there's still pieces of this monster sitting at the bottom of a Canadian lake. Let's dive in. Okay, so before we get to the ice ship, and trust me, we're getting there, we need to understand why anyone would even consider this idea in the first place. It's 1942. The Battle of the Atlantic is raging. And if you don't know what that is, imagine the world's deadliest game of cat and mouse, played out across 3,000 miles of freezing ocean. Here's the situation. Britain is an island. Everything they need, food, fuel, weapons, supplies, has to come by ship from America and Canada. And Germany knows this. So they unleash hundreds of U-boats, submarines, to hunt down these supply convoys and sink them. And it's working terrifyingly well. At the peak of the battle, German U-boats were sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. We're talking about 700,000 tons of shipping lost every single month. That's not a typo. 700,000 tons. If this continued, Britain would literally starve. The war would be over. Hitler wins. So the Allies desperately needed a solution. They needed air cover over the Atlantic to spot and sink these U-boats before they could attack. But here's the problem. Planes couldn't fly that far. American bombers could only cover about 300 miles from the coast. Then there was this massive gap in the middle of the Atlantic, what they called the Black Pit, where no planes could reach. And U-boats knew it. They'd hang out in that gap like sharks at an all-you-can-eat buffet. Now, the obvious solution was aircraft carriers, right? Just sail them with the convoys, provide air cover the whole way across. Problem solved. Except, it wasn't that simple. Building aircraft carriers was incredibly expensive, took years, and required massive amounts of steel and resources that were desperately needed elsewhere. Plus, aircraft carriers were valuable targets themselves. Lose one, and you just lost a huge investment and hundreds of trained crew. So the Allies were stuck. They needed aircraft carriers, but they couldn't afford to build enough of them fast enough. And that's when things got weird. Let me introduce you to Geoffrey Pike. Now, if there was ever a person who looked like a mad scientist, it was this guy. Wild hair, intense eyes, talked a mile a minute about ideas that range from genius to what medication are you on. Pike was officially listed as an inventor and strategic thinker. Unofficially, he was Churchill's go-to guy for ideas that were so bonkers they might actually work. This was the man who once proposed parachuting commandos into Norway on bicycles. I'm not making this up. He genuinely suggested dropping soldiers from planes on bikes to pedal through enemy territory. And somehow, parts of that plan were actually used. So when Pike walked into a meeting in 1942 and said, "I know how to solve the aircraft carrier problem," people probably braced themselves. His solution? Build them out of ice. Ice. The room went silent. You can imagine the faces, the awkward coughs. Someone probably checked if it was too early to start drinking. But Pike wasn't finished. He explained his reasoning, and honestly, it started to make a twisted kind of sense. Think about it. Ice is free. It's literally frozen water. You know what else the North Atlantic had a lot of? Water. And cold. You could build an ice ship for a fraction of the cost of steel. No need to compete with tank and plane production for resources. But wait, ice melts, right? And ice is brittle. One torpedo and your frozen ship becomes a very expensive slushy. That's where Pike's genius came in. He wasn't talking about regular ice. He was talking about something called pykrete, a mixture of ice and wood pulp, basically ice with sawdust frozen into it. And pykrete was insane. All right, Let me blow your mind for a second about pykrete. First, it was as strong as concrete. Not kind of strong, as strong as actual concrete. You could build with it like you were working with stone. Second, it melted 3 to 5 times slower than regular ice. So while normal ice would be puddles in a few hours, pykrete would last for days, even weeks, in relatively warm temperatures. But here's the absolute kicker, the thing that made everyone's jaws drop. It was bulletproof. I'm serious. Scientists did tests where they fired bullets at pykrete blocks, and the bullets just bounced off, like you were shooting at a wall. In some tests, the pykrete blocks barely even got scratched. There's this famous story, probably exaggerated, but too good not to tell, where someone was demonstrating pykrete to a group of high-ranking officers. To prove how tough it was, they fired a pistol at a block of pykrete. The bullet ricocheted off and nearly hit one of the admirals. Everyone immediately became a believer. Think about what this meant for shipbuilding. You can make a ship hull 10, 15, even 20 feet thick with pykrete, and torpedoes would barely dent it. A German torpedo might crack the outer layer, but the ship itself would keep floating. You'd need dozens of direct hits to do serious damage. This was a material that was stronger than ice, cheap to make, available in unlimited quantities, nearly indestructible, self-repairing. Just spray some water mixed with wood pulp on the cracks and let it freeze. The only downside? Well, it was still ice, so you needed to keep it cold. But we'll get to that problem later. For now, the scientists were convinced. Pike pitched the idea up the chain of command, and eventually, it landed on Churchill's desk. And Churchill, God bless the man, was absolutely delighted. So once Churchill gave the green light, the engineers went absolutely wild with the design. They weren't thinking small. Oh no, when you're building an aircraft carrier out of ice, apparently the attitude is go big or go home. Let me give you the specs for what they plan to build. Length, 2,000 feet. That's 600 meters. For comparison, a modern aircraft carrier is about 1,000 feet. This thing would have been twice as long as a Nimitz-class carrier. Width, 300 feet, about 90 meters. That's wider than a football field. Height, 200 feet. That's a 20-story building. Floating, made of ice. Hull thickness, up to 40 feet, 12 meters of solid pykrete. You could literally drive torpedoes into this thing all day and it would just shrug them off. Weight, 2.2 million tons. To put that in perspective, the Titanic weighed 52,000 tons. This ice ship would have weighed as much as 40 Titanics. Inside this frozen fortress, you'd have a full flight deck with runways, hangars for 150 aircraft, living quarters for up to 4,000 crew members, workshops, storage, kitchens, medical facilities, enough fuel and supplies to stay at sea for months. Oh, and because it's basically a giant ice cube with refrigeration systems running through it, you'd never have to worry about it melting, even in the middle of summer. The plan was to build several of these things and station them permanently in the Atlantic. They'd be unsinkable floating air bases that could provide cover for every convoy crossing the ocean. The Germans would be helpless. Their U-boats would become sitting ducks. It was brilliant, audacious, absolutely mel. And here's the craziest part. They actually started building it. Most people think Project Habakkuk was just a concept, a crazy idea that stayed on paper. Nope, they built a prototype, a real, functioning, floating proof of concept. Location, Patricia Lake, Alberta, Canada, middle of nowhere. Perfect for a secret military project involving a giant ice cube. The prototype was scaled down, about 60 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 20 feet tall. Still pretty massive considering it was made of ice. The team was led by engineers who'd normally be designing bridges and dams, now suddenly working with frozen wood pulp. The construction process was absolutely bonkers. They had 200 workers operating in shifts 24 hours a day. They built a wooden frame, then started layering pykrete, mixing wood pulp with water, spraying it onto the frame, letting it freeze, repeat. Again and again and again. Inside the structure, they installed an actual refrigeration system. Pipes running through the walls, pumping cold air to keep everything frozen. It was like building a ship inside a giant walk-in freezer. The whole thing took about 2 months to build through the winter of 1943. And then came the test. Would it float? Would it hold together? Would it immediately melt into a sad puddle? They cut it loose from the shore, and it worked. The prototype floated perfectly. Stable. Solid. Barely any melting. Then came the real test. They left it there. Through the spring. Through the summer. In Canada, where summer temperatures can hit 80 or 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And you know what happened? It barely melted. The refrigeration system kept the core frozen. The outer layers would soften slightly during the day, but refreeze at night. By the end of summer, the prototype was still intact, still floating. The proof was undeniable. You could build a ship out of pykrete, and it would work. Scientists were ecstatic. Churchill was thrilled. The project moved into the next phase, planning the full-scale construction. And that's when reality came crashing in. Okay, so building a small prototype in a Canadian lake? Totally doable. Building a 2,000-foot-long, 2-million-ton aircraft carrier made of ice? That's where things got complicated. Problem number 1, time. The engineers calculated it would take about 8,000 workers an entire year just to build one ship. And they wanted to build multiple ships. Meanwhile, the war wasn't waiting. Every month of delay meant more ships sunk, more lives lost. Problem number 2, resources. Remember how pykrete is made from wood pulp? You know how much would you need to make 2.2 million tons of pykrete? An absolutely staggering amount. We're talking entire forests worth of timber. And during wartime, timber was already in high demand for everything from building barracks to making plane propellers. Problem number 3, steel. Yes, really. The irony here is almost painful. The whole point of building an ice ship was to avoid using steel. But to keep a ship that size frozen, you'd need massive refrigeration systems. Thousands of miles of pipes. Enormous cooling units. All made of steel. The project that was supposed to save steel ended up requiring tons of it anyway. Problem number 4, speed, or lack thereof. This is the big one, the killer problem. The proposed ship would have a maximum speed of about 6 to 7 knots. That's roughly 7 to 8 miles per hour. For context, a standard convoy moved at about 10 to 15 knots. A modern aircraft carrier does 30 plus knots. This ice fortress would be slower than the ships it was supposed to protect. It could provide air cover for a general area, sure, but actually keeping up with a moving convoy? Forget it. You'd essentially be building a floating airbase that could very slowly drift around the Atlantic. Problem number 5, cost. By the time all the calculations were done, the estimated cost had ballooned to somewhere between $70 million and $100 million per ship in 1943 money. For comparison, a regular Essex-class aircraft carrier cost about $70 million and could be built in 18 months. And it was faster and more maneuverable and didn't require constant refrigeration. The ice ship was supposed to be the cheap option. By late 1943, the writing was on the wall. The Allies were turning the tide in the Atlantic. American shipyards had ramped up production like crazy. They were pumping out Liberty ships faster than the Germans could sink them. New escort carriers were entering service. Long-range patrol aircraft were finally covering more of the Atlantic. The U-boats were starting to lose. In May 1943 alone, the Germans lost 41 U-boats. It was called Black May by the German Navy. The hunters had become the hunted. Suddenly, the need for a massive ice aircraft carrier didn't seem so urgent anymore. In December 1943, the project was officially canceled. The reasons given were practical. Too expensive, too slow, too many resources required. But the real reason was simpler. It just wasn't needed anymore. All the documents were classified. The prototype on Patricia Lake was abandoned. Workers were told not to talk about what they'd been building. And just like that, one of the most audacious engineering projects in history disappeared into secrecy. But the story doesn't quite end there. So what happened to the prototype? Well, they didn't exactly have a disposal plan for a 1,500-ton ice ship. You can't just drag it to shore and break it up. So they did the practical thing. They just left it. Through 1944, the prototype slowly melted. The refrigeration system was shut off. Summer came, and gradually, month by month, the ice fortress sank deeper into Patricia Lake. By 1945, most of it had melted and collapsed. The wooden frame sank to the bottom. The metal pipes, the refrigeration equipment, all the infrastructure, it all just stayed down there. And here's the thing, it's still there. In the 1970s and 80s, divers explored Patricia Lake and found the remains. Pipes, metal frameworks, pieces of the cooling system, all lying on the lake bed like some weird archaeological site from a war that was fought with ice. There's been some recovery efforts over the years, mostly by historians and military buffs who think this story deserves to be remembered. A few pieces have been brought up and are in museums now, but most of it still down there. A ghost of one of World War II's strangest projects. Okay, here's the fun part. Let's play What If for a minute. What if they'd actually completed a full-size Project Habakkuk ship? What if it had sailed into the Atlantic in 1944? Honestly, it probably would have been kind of disappointing. Don't get me wrong, it would have looked absolutely incredible. Imagine a convoy of cargo ships sailing along, and then suddenly there's this massive white fortress floating next to them. 2,000 feet of ice and steel. Planes taking off and landing. The Germans would have been absolutely baffled, but tactically, it would have struggled. Too slow to keep up with modern naval warfare. Too big to be maneuverable. By 1944, the Allies had air superiority and were already winning the Battle of the Atlantic. That said, Project Habakkuk did accomplish something important. It showed what's possible when you think completely outside the box. Sometimes the craziest ideas push technology and engineering in new directions. Plus, imagine the propaganda value. Can you picture the newsreels? Allied forces unveil unsinkable ice fortress. The morale boost alone might have been worth something. Closing, the legacy. So here's what I find fascinating about Project Habakkuk. It wasn't a failure. Not really. It was a solution to a problem that, by the time they could build it, no longer existed. The Allies won the Battle of the Atlantic through other means, better tactics, more ships, improved technology. But for a brief moment in history, the British government seriously considered building aircraft carriers out of ice. They tested it. They proved it could work. They got Winston Churchill himself to sign off on spending millions of dollars on frozen wood pulp. And you know what? In the dark days of 1942, when Britain was genuinely facing starvation and defeat, that kind of creative, desperate, absolutely bonkers thinking might have been exactly what was needed. Sometimes the craziest ideas aren't crazy at all. They're just early. So, final question. Should they have built it? Part of me says no. It was too slow, too expensive, and ultimately unnecessary. But another part of me looks at that prototype sitting at the bottom of Patricia Lake and thinks, man, I wish I could have seen the full-scale version. Just once. Just to witness something that audacious actually floating in the ocean. What do you think? Would you have approved Project Habakkuk if you're Churchill? Would you have wanted to see a 2,000-foot ice fortress sailing the Atlantic? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's weirdest projects, hit that like button and subscribe. How about more strange history coming your way? Until next time, stay curious. And remember, sometimes the best ideas are the ones that sound completely insane.